Thanks everyone for joining us on a Friday evening. And I'm Nick Gevock. I'm the Conservation Director at the Montana Wildlife Federation, and I'm up in Kalispell this evening. And we're here to have a talk about public access to public lands. And we're joined by Mary Erickson, who is the supervisor of the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. Is that right, Mary? I have the title, yeah. And John Salazar, who is a board member of the Montana Wildlife Federation. Mary's in Bozeman area or in the Gallatin Valley, and John is piping in from Livingston, his home. And of course, you know, it is, I have to say, it's political season, and I noticed that every single political candidate is for public access to public lands. I have not seen an ad from someone saying I'm against public access, but so we're here tonight to sort of flesh this, talk a little bit about what that means and what efforts are underway to improve public access to public lands. So Mary, thanks for joining us, and John. So public access to public land, what is it? You know, with the Montana Wildlife Federation, at least, we define access as getting to public land. And that's important because once you reach that boundary, efforts there are travel planning, you know, because we manage land for all kinds of different goals, for wildlife security habitat, for public recreation, for hunting, for fishing, for hiking, for backpacking. And I like to talk a lot about, you know, it's no different than when I've had the privilege of hunting on private land. I've never had a landowner, a rancher say, well, you can drive everywhere on my ranch. They tell you which roads are open and which aren't closed. But as far as getting to public land and access to it, it can be a real challenge at times because of the history of how our national forest system came to be. And anybody who looks at maps of Montana knows that we have a lot of checkerboarded lands where every other section is private or public. And that really is the legacy of the Lincoln Railroad grants, frankly. And we could look back to a time when Abraham Lincoln was trying to settle the West, and it really wasn't thinking about us going elk hunting or backpacking in 2020. And so that checkerboard creates a lot of management challenges for the Forest Service. It creates management challenges for private landowners who have those parcels that are intertwined with public lands. And it creates challenges for the public who wants to enjoy its public lands. So, and addressing those challenges often involves some very big, complicated land deals. That is one of the issues we're going to talk about tonight are both land trades, purchase and targeted purchases, as well as easements to get to those public lands. So let me back up a little bit. As far as access, we at the Montana Wildlife Federation work on a whole series of policies on the state level to improve access. Clearly, the block management program opens up access to private lands, but also a lot of adjoining public lands. We have, which is a stellar program with more than 6 million acres in it. Of course, we have Habitat Montana, which is really our flagship state conservation and access program that funds through hunter license dollars, targeted fee title purchases of really key lands that for wildlife management areas, but also conservation easements. And those easements protect private lands from development and subdivision. But they also open up public hunting access, again, to those private lands, but also to adjoining public lands. And I just want to point out that based on a really tough court fight in 2018 about conservation easements and whether the state land board had to approve those, which it doesn't, we have more interest than we've ever had in Habitat Montana. In August, the Fish and Wildlife Commission closed out more than 21,400 acres of conservation easements in eastern Montana. And those were just stellar projects, really quality wildlife habitat. And again, that's the private lands protected. That opens up access to thousands of acres of adjoining public lands. We have the Public Access to Lands Act, which passed in the 2019 legislature to fund easements to public land. We have the Unlocking State Lands program that was passed in the 2013 session and renewed again in 2017. So we have a whole toolbox of tools to improve access to public lands. Now, I want to get back into the checkerboarded and the complicated issues around intermixed ownership of public lands and checkerboard. For years, we've been dealing with that legacy through conservation actions of targeted purchases of lands when they become available, as well as large land trades with willing private landowners. And a lot of those purchases, of course, are funded using the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as Habitat Montana, as well as private nonprofit conservation organization dollars, as well as sometimes donated value from the landowners who want to leave some type of conservation legacy. So those of you who have been around Montana for a long time know there was a guy named Bob Denny who really did a tremendous amount of work to consolidate those public lands all through south in large swaths around Bozeman on the Gallatin. Mary, where else did Bob do a lot of work? I don't know where you were in your career at the time, but when Bob was working out some of those significant land trades and purchases.
You know, Nick, I knew of Bob Denny, but my knowledge of him before I came to Montana was always his work on the Gallatin National Forest and the big land trades there, where we probably have had one of the most significant land trade and land acquisition programs of any national forest in the country.
Right. And so, you know, we're having a general conversation about public access to public lands, but of course, one that's received a lot of attention in the last few years and been an ongoing issue are the Crazy Mountains, just outside of Big Timber, north and west of Big Timber, where you have a really complicated, again, checkerboard and such a mixed map. Anybody who's looked at the Crazies has seen how jumbled this is. And there's been a pretty concerted effort in recent years to improve access into those areas. And I'd like Mary to talk a little bit about those efforts to kick off this conversation. And then John will come in and talk about a working group that he's been participating in for almost over 2 years now, John, I think.
Right at 2 years. They've been at it longer than I have, but yes, I've been involved for almost 2 years, yes.
Okay. So Mary, if you talk a little bit about the Crazies and I was at a public meeting a year ago with one of the several proposals. I'd let you just talk about that a little bit and what your goals are and what we're working on.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nick. And you know, I think we're all getting used to in this COVID era doing a lot of meetings at a lot of forums virtually, but it never feels quite the same because you can't actually see people and have that back and forth conversation. So thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Also on the line is from the Custer Gallatin National Forest is Lauren Oswald. Lauren is our services staff person for the forest, and she oversees all of our recreation, wilderness, engineering, heritage, and lands programs, and has been instrumental in some of the work that we're doing right now in the Crazies. So what I'll try to do is give the maybe the 30,000 foot level of conversation about the Crazies, and then obviously fair game to answer any questions people have, because I'm trying to think about how to even set the stage. So I've been with the Forest Service for about 30, I think I'm going on 38 years this year, have been in Montana for about 12 years. In my previous assignments, you know, as a district ranger and forest supervisor, I always dealt with lands issues. But when I came to the Gallatin and then later the Custer Gallatin, the legacy of lands work here, the complexity of lands work here is really it's beyond what I had experienced throughout the rest of my career.
Right.
I find lands work to be challenging, fascinating, and it's always about, you know, in my mind, it's always about taking the long view. because lands work doesn't, I mean, this is probably fairly obvious stuff, and I know there's people out there listening who have been in lands for so much of their time as well. But so many things we do in public lands, we work on something for a few years and we expect to see implementation and we expect to see results. And in the world of lands, uh, issues and challenges have developed over decades, and resolutions and negotiations often take that long as well. So the Custer Gallatin is, as a combined forest, is a little bit over 3 million acres, spreading from West Yellowstone, across with districts in Bozeman, Livingston, Gardner, and then stretching all the way to Camp Crook, South Dakota. And as folks might imagine, there are lands and access needs across that landscape. And that's true of every national forest in Montana and in the system. But our reality is we don't have unlimited resources, and we don't have unlimited capacity to really address all the needs that are out there. So we always have to prioritize our work. And I think it would be fair to say, I reflect going back to Bob Denny's time, because Bob is now retired. The Forest Service, the Gallatin Forest in particular at the time, always knew that the complexity of issues in the crazies has been with us for a long, long time. And there have been some past legal actions, there have been some resolutions, but the crazies writ large, the complexity of that checkerboard ownership and the needs for access and the unperfected access in the crazies has been with us a long, long time. And the forest had, many years ago has identified various access needs, various challenges in the crazies. But and we've had past resolutions, and we can talk about some of those. But our reality is we also have had many unresolved issues in the crazies for a long, long time. And some of those have been identified on our, kind of on what we call our program of work, our list of, major needs on the forest. And those had been out there for a long time, including the issue with the Porcupine Lowline Trail on the west side, with the checkerboard ownership on the south side, and what had been in the works for many years, what we call the South Crazies Land Exchange, and then a lot of complexity on the east side of the crazies. And then, of course, that doesn't even take into account the pieces of the crazies that are up on the Helena, Lewis, and Clark. So we've known about many, many of those issues for a long time, and I've always had those on these are priorities that we need to get into the queue. We need to have the time and energy and capacity to move forward. And without going into a lot of detail, obviously a couple years ago, a lot of heightened attention to the crazies, some, conflict between Forest Service, kind of how the Forest Service was approaching things, and private landowners, and a lot of things came to a head. People wrote to their congressional offices, they wrote to the Secretary of Agriculture, a lot of kind of a lot of dust up over that. And as we looked at that, as we looked at those issues, I think the first thing we would acknowledge as the Forest Service is there's no simple answer to the issues in the crazies. We've known about those challenges for a long time. We can't solve them all at once. And so one of the things that happened in the midst of all that kind of that high media attention, high attention to some of the complex issues in the crazies, and as we were reflecting, okay, how do we start to work on this in a way that is productive? And Nick, I think you said this to me in talking, land solutions they're incremental. I mean, they should add up to something big over the years, but you're always looking for what's that incremental forward progress. And we had an offer back in, I think it was 2017, by a group that was actually initiated by the Crazy Mountain Stock Growers to come to a forum. Would people even be willing to just start talking to each other? Not legal battles, but just would you be willing to even be in a room with people who saw this in a different way and start to just talk and start to develop relationships and at least try to have a civil dialogue. And that group started to have a dialogue, brought some access advocates, brought Ryan Weiss from the state. He was kind of the state access coordinator, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, some local access advocates out of Livingston, and a bunch of landowners, and started that dialogue. And that dialogue, the first meeting, I really wondered whether that was going to be a worthwhile endeavor. It was pretty tense. We were obviously on very different sides, but that group kept meeting and kept keeping those lines of communication open. And eventually, I want to give credit to John. Then finally, the group acknowledged they needed to open that up to more people, and Montana Wildlife Federation came to the group and has been represented. Now that group is called the Crazy Mountain Working Group, and then has also morphed into some other working groups that John, maybe you may be talking about. That group, contrary to what people talk about, didn't cut any backroom deals. We didn't pour over maps and say this is what we're going to do and what we're going to agree to. Really, it was about dialogue of how do we start to work on some of the issues in the crazies, and maybe what would be the priorities. One of the things that came out of that for the Forest Service was we looked at the crazies as a large landscape, and we identified three broad priorities and kind of put these in order. Our first priority was on the west side, really tackling the questions around the old Porcupine Lowline Trail that was, and I can go into any of these more because I'm just going to give you a snapshot of each and then see where people's interest is. So the Porcupine Lowline Trail had been a historic trail on maps for many, many years. It had been, the Forest Service had made some decisions about use on that trail in our travel planning process. But of course, we never had recorded easements on that trail as it crossed through private land. And I will say very honestly, the decisions we made in our travel planning process also raised the ire of the landowner there, because we mapped that as motorized access right across that, on that historic route across private property. So a couple years ago, when we identified the big issues in the crazies, we said the first thing we want to work on is the west side, and really taking a look at what's the best long-term resolution on the west side. And I say this recognizing what we also know in lands is you never please everyone. People always have there's a lot of different approaches and a lot of different ideas on what's the right path. And for me, lands negotiations is really the art of the possible. I mean, we want to have resolutions, but we also need to work within what we think is actually practical and doable and will resolve problems. So we prioritized the Porcupine Lowline Trail and a resolution of that. And in the end, in that case, we focused on a trail reroute to get that major trail up onto the national forest with some donated easements from the landowner and some negotiations around that. The second big priority had been, really goes back to, you mentioned Bob Denny. I mean, Bob Denny had worked on some of the initial packaging of what's called the South Crazies Land Exchange. And people always think, my God, what is the Forest Service doing when it takes 10 years working on a land exchange? But it isn't really, there's not like 10 years of constant work on it. It's as if it's in the queue with a lot of other projects. There's negotiations, parts and pieces of the negotiations. Some of them stall out for a while and the exchange kind of gets put on hold because those negotiations aren't going anywhere. You're vying for budget and resources with other projects on other forests, because we share a land zone with all of eastern Montana and the Dakotas. So we can only bring so many projects forward. So it takes a while for a project to basically come forward through that process. So Bob Denny had started on the South Crazies Land Exchange all those years ago before he retired. And we had put that as our number 2 priority in the crazies, which was, let's bring a proposal forward. Let's finish the negotiations with those 3 landowners involved in that, and let's bring forth a proposal and bring that to the public through the public NEPA process. And we brought that forth last fall, and at this point, we've evaluated all the public comment. We've been working back and forth with the affected landowners, and we're saying about a month from rolling out a draft decision that goes out for an objection process on the South Crazies Land Exchange. And then our third priority was the whole complex east side on the Crazies, which when you look at the east side of the Crazies, and I'm sure many people out there know that area well, you could work for many, many years trying to work with each individual landowner and kind of parts and pieces of what a solution might look like there. And we struggled for the longest time trying to figure out, how do we have that conversation on the east side with 6 different landowners and quite a varied history on our relationships with those landowners and access issues, et cetera. And we put that as our third priority, acknowledging that that was out there, and really had some momentum within the last couple of years when we were able to actually initiate conversations with all 6 landowners. And then the Yellowstone Club, who was really wanting the Forest Service to work with them on a separate land exchange in the Big Sky area, which we had turned down twice for not having adequate public benefit, came to meet with us and said, okay, what would, if we really believe in this exchange over in the Big Sky area, but clearly the Forest Service isn't going to move this forward without something that creates broader public benefit. What are your most pressing lands or access needs? And of course, at the time, there was some conversation around Dome Mountain. And I think folks know what was going on with Dome Mountain at the time. That all fell apart. And we said, well, if you want a really tricky, thorny issue, the whole east side of the Crazies, we need to have some way to really think about and pull people together. And we provided some principles around that. And we said, we could use some help there. And that group then took off with some of the principles we gave them and began to meet with the landowners. And I think that's probably part of John's story, because that also morphed into a working group that Montana Wildlife Federation is participating in that really is forming a proposal for the east side.
Great.
Nick, I probably should stop there because I know there's lots of places we could go with that, but it might be worth, maybe we go directly to John, or I'm certainly open to answering any question. I just realized I didn't give you this caveat. The only caveat, and we will be happy to share or discuss anything we possibly can, but as folks are probably aware, we also are in litigation on our kind of on lands and access issues in the Crazies. And so we can talk about anything relative to policy or how we see things, but we won't be able to do a deep dive into any particular trails or routes that are at issue in that litigation in the Crazies.
Well, okay, maybe it would be, yeah. And I'll say, I mean, I think, I'll credit District Ranger Alex Sikovich for raising attention on this issue and getting it out there that we want to improve some access into the Crazies. But why don't we let you, John, talk about how the east side, the working group, a little bit, and where we're at with that, how it evolved, and how we got to where we are today.
Certainly. Well, it was started by the landowners on the east side, actually going, we need to have a conversation about where we are and how we can improve relations with the public and public access and all those sorts of things. So the Crazy Mountain Stock Growers Association started this whole thing, and it's, they wanted to join with other groups that wanted to have some conversation. So we were very fortunate that we were able to do that with Park County Environmental Council as one of the groups, some concerned citizens, and Montana Wildlife Federation, and thankfully the Forest Service, who, we just wanted to have a conversation. We wanted to figure out, we don't always know where each other stands, but as we've gotten through this last couple of years, we've started to learn what each other needs and what each other's needs and wants are, and trying to figure out how to make this happen. And so we are very fortunate that Mary Erickson with the Forest Service, she's been involved kind of on, just doing her thing and being very honest with us about where the Forest Service is and where the money is and all that. And so we've really worked hard to come together to find some solutions. I think, the first thing you have to do is you have to be at the table. You have to have some conversation, right? You have to have if you're not at the table, you're not going to eat. That's kind of the thing that we always talk about, right? So,
Or you're on the menu.
or you're, yeah, no doubt you're going to get eaten. Exactly. And so, it's been a fantastic, for me, group to work with because there's no sides. It's more about what are we going to do about fixing this. The crazies are crazy in the sense like it's checkerboarded so badly that it was a good thing, right? When the railroad came through and they needed some timber to power the trains and all that sort of thing. But it makes it complex, really a really complex issue now when we are no longer in that era of how to get public access, how to respect private property rights, which is equally as important to me as the public access part. And so this group has been amazing as far as my learning. I think that anytime you're involved in customer service, sorry, it's another thing. When you're a public servant, you have to learn to listen. And one of the great things about this group is we've learned to listen to each other's needs and wants and figured out how to negotiate through that to get something that everyone can work with and deal with. So it's been a great learning experience for me.
So, John, the rough proposal that group came up with, just talk about it in general terms, and again, it's just a proposal out there at this point in its infancy, right? And talk about that a little bit.
It's almost a proposal to the Forest Service, but so the idea is there's a land exchange between the Yellowstone Club. They want to have a deal. They have, and actually, if you look at the whole proposal, the Big Sky deal is a great thing. It's a good thing. It gets a little more complex in the east side of the crazies as far as that goes. But we've worked really hard at trying to figure out how to make that happen. We're trying to, these are just ideas, kind of anytime you're in a negotiation like this, I feel like you're not going to get everything you want, I guess, so that's just kind of the nature of it. But you work hard and you establish relationships with folks. And so we worked really hard at making that happen. So, yeah.
Sure. I've said this 3,000 times. I have never, and I was a newspaper reporter before I came to this job, but I have never seen a perfect land trade. I mean, there are compromises on both sides. That said, I mean, us being the Montana Wildlife Federation, sometimes with some of our conservation partners, we might, sometimes you're trading mid elevation lands for what, for lack of a better term, is the rock and ice, which might have, better hiking values or something, but not necessarily as high a wildlife values. But in general, the proposal that this early proposal on the east side, one, we gained some lands. Two, John came, and John's lived in Livingston for many years and said, this is not junk. I mean, that whole east side between Sweetgrass Creek and Big Timber, is it Big Timber Canyon? Yeah, that is good stuff, you said. And I think that it's important for people to know, if they would see the letter we submitted, that we asked for some really pretty solid stipulations on this trade, and I'll go through those. One was that lands that leave public ownership and enter private ownership have conservation easements to prevent them from being developed. No movement of the forest boundary. A right of first refusal should those parcels that become private ever come on the market, so that the public or a land trust has at least a first crack at buying them in the public interest. And then lastly, nothing affects this the litigation that is largely centered on Sweetgrass Creek. And so, you know, we asked for a lot, but we wanted to stress that our long-term goal would be to have all of the in-holdings in the crazy. So we saw this as a first step, as the beginning and not the end.
It's definitely the first step. And, you know, there's one more thing to think about is we wanted this to be we didn't want this to be legislative.
Yeah.
We wanted the public process to happen. And why is that? Because we want the public to have their right to be able to tell us whether they like it or not. And, you know, maybe there's some other suggestions out there. We don't know, but we're working hard to just make this better for the public.
And, you know, I have stressed this, that, you know, we're putting something out there and we want to hear from the public. In fact, I think Mary will agree that the South Side proposal, MWF, and a lot of the public that commented on that, we agreed with 2/3 of it. There was about 1/3 of it that we said, you know, we heard overwhelmingly from our membership that there were 2 particular sections that were just too good as wildlife habitat. And that's okay. I mean, we're putting it out there as a starting point to really, you know, you're never going to make progress if you don't start the conversation, not just with a small group, but with that broader public. I don't know, Mary, if you have some thoughts on that, but.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I would just echo what John said, is that as the group of landowners and access advocates and others, along with the facilitator from the Yellowstone Club, has had the dialogue on the east side, our consistent position was exactly the same as John expressed we really did not like the idea of a legislative proposal. And we don't take away from, we also always say to people, obviously, Congress has that authority, and we don't tell them, you know, we don't make that determination. But we were always very clear that given the complexity of the crazies, given how passionate people are, given that people have all sorts of views or perspectives or ideas on what they think is possible or right, we just felt like a legislative solution would send the wrong message. It would create this impression that you're trying to really pull a fast one without some legitimate public process. So we've really been on that wavelength. So Nick, I'll just play on a little bit more, because as this group has been working on that, actually, Lauren and I were just out on the east side of the crazies today, really starting to look at a little bit more of that from a time frame perspective on the east side proposal. We believe there's still been ongoing dialogue with this group to flesh out and kind of finesse the proposal that comes to the Forest Service in final form. Then we would take a look at that, kind of acknowledge the receipt of that proposal, probably later this calendar year. Then we go through a whole feasibility determination around Forest Service policy. So this has been crafted in a really collaborative way with with wildlife interests and landowner interests and access interests. But then the Forest Service has to take a look at that, and we have to actually put that through our policy lens as well. And there's a whole lot of steps that we could talk about. But then once that happens and it passes feasibility and we have a proposal that we think passes muster, then we go through the public process. And right now we're telling folks probably the earliest you would see any public scoping on that east side proposal is something like next June, right? That would be when that would roll out. So I just wanted to share that because I know people, that as that was networked and John, as the public meetings were held on that, there were a lot of people who really appreciated seeing something put forward and some signs of progress. But I know we also heard some angst from people because they felt like if this was slipped through in a legislative process, or could this slip through without us being able to weigh in? So really the earliest that could come out to a public process is probably early next summer. Would go through a full kind of a proposal the Forest Service would put forth, a full environmental analysis with all of the resource issues addressed, And, and so the public could take a look at that, provide comment. The one thing I'd share, and this is probably so basic, but I always have to say it within land exchanges because it's, when the Forest Service does other projects that we have, that all the parts and pieces are within our control. You're planning a timber sale that's a thinning, and maybe you propose 300 acres, but we could choose to do 50 acres, or we could choose to do 172 acres, or all 300. The challenge with land exchanges is they're a little bit more complex, right? Because there are a whole series of negotiations. So often we go out to the public with a no action. You go with things as they are, and with an action alternative, basically the proposal that's been crafted. That doesn't mean the final decision is exactly what's out there, because you really want to hear from the public. But I think it's also good for people to understand not everything is possible, right? Because it's an amalgamation of a number of considerations all together, and the Forest Service just can't say, okay, we're going to pull out this thread and the rest of it still goes. You pull that out and you lose one landowner in a proposal where everyone's bound together, and the whole thing may fall apart. So that's only to acknowledge land exchanges, and the NEPA process is incredibly important, and it's complicated. And so you're looking for some negotiating room in that, but it's not as if you have every bit of ability to negotiate, because there's all sorts. There's the equalization of the appraisals and the market value. There's the fact that every landowner has to be still in agreement. And in this one, you have 6 landowners, and you have the Yellowstone Club piece. So it's going to be a complex exchange if and when it goes to the public. But we're pretty excited that it feels like it's about time to put that forward and really get some comment on it. The other thing is we really want to time the draft decision and have people see where we landed with the South Crazy Land Exchange first, so people can see what did we think, how did we consider the comment we got, and that will come out first so that people can really address that.
Right. Well, and I'll just say that, the administrative process can seem cumbersome and slow, and frankly, that's a good thing. That is in place to protect the public interest in these public resources, government makes big mistakes when it moves too quickly sometimes. And secondly, if you think legislation is some quick fix, anybody who knows when it comes to federal land deals or it took a decade to pass the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act. So, if that became an option down the road, I don't think you would see any members of the congressional delegation interested in that until they see broad public support. A broad, large public support like we had for the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act. I think that's a good choice to first off get that South side out there, let people digest it, look at the objections process, and then put out whatever that proposal on the east side looks like. I wanted to point out to people watching that we just gained an access not into the heart of the east side, but north of Sweetgrass Creek through an easement that involves both the Forest Service and the state DNRC, the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. And that took over a decade, didn't it, Mary, working with landowner Mac White? And it's walk-in access, but it accesses some tremendous country north of Sweetgrass Creek. It is 3 miles of walking, but it's really flat. And once you're in there, it is some really superb wildlife habitat, and particularly for elk and elk hunters. But I don't know, Mary, if you got any comments on that one.
The only thing I'd say, I think a ton of credit goes to the perseverance of folks on the Helena, Lewis and Clark,
That's right.
The district ranger and the forest up there. The other thing I think so how long it takes and how much perseverance it takes on some of these situations, I think is I think the point we would make. The other thing that is a great tool on the Mac White deal that it doesn't happen in every case. But one of the advantages they had in that situation, now I'm looking at this through my Forest Service lens, I realize, is we have what's called reciprocity, right? A private landowner, where a private landowner needs or wants access across national forest, really gives us a tool, a negotiating tool to gain access across private property. We don't have, and I share that because it's a great tool that the agency has, but it doesn't exist in all cases.
Right.
So where there is a need for reciprocity, where a landowner needs something in terms of access across the national forest, it's one of the better negotiating tools we have to actually work a deal. And even that, because in the Mac White case there is reciprocity, even that, at least in talking to Bill Avey, I think it probably was even more than 10 years.
And let's be honest here. There was some litigation involved that, Mac White had sued and, but, on both ends, sometimes that's the way things move forward. Mary, I know I did get a question from someone, and I know I don't want you to get into the specifics of litigation, but can you talk about the timing when we're expected to have some resolution of the backcountry hunters and anglers lawsuit and the several other groups? Just timing, do you know, or is it still in the motions phase? Or
Yeah, well, I think we would say we wish we knew. You know, as a public land agency, we're pretty used to dealing with litigation.
Sure.
We understand that, we know it's part of the process. That being said, it's a little discouraging because it takes a lot of time and energy to address litigation, and it feels like when you're addressing that, you put a lot of resources to addressing that, and you're not able to address other things. We don't have a time frame, and the judge doesn't have a time frame to rule in that. Just about, Lauren can correct me on this, but it's been about a week and a half ago that Judge Cavan ruled just on one of the motions that were pending about the record. There's one more motion pending, and we don't even have a briefing schedule. So
Okay.
after all this time, we're a little discouraged. But when that lawsuit first started out, one of the first parts and pieces of that lawsuit is there was a kind of a request for preliminary injunction, a request to the court to enjoin the Forest Service, basically say that we could not move ahead with the trail reroute on the west side. And the judge denied that preliminary injunction. And so when the judge denied that, we proceeded with the first phase of trail construction from the Porcupine Cabin up Elk Creek. And then this year we awarded the phase 2 contract, where that trail goes about another, I guess I'm going to ask Lauren to correct me, basically about 8 miles to the south, with the eventual in phase 3 connection to the Ibex cabin. So that's to say, in the overall lawsuit, we did get a decision early on that denied a request for injunction on the trail construction, which for us was a good sign because it allowed us to, it meant that there was no compelling case to be made to halt that, and it allowed us to proceed with that trail reroute. But the only other movement we've had are a couple motions that we just got some traction on. We don't even have a briefing schedule. Our hope would be into next year. Our hope would be very soon we'd have a briefing schedule and maybe some decision in 2021.
Okay. Well, as I say it a lot, but I'm thankful to live in a country where I can sue the government if I don't think it's following the law. And sometimes it might seem messy, but sometimes things get advanced that way. So, well, John, I'm wondering if the Crazy Mountains Working Group, now that there is an initial proposal, still meeting and talk about that a little bit more.
Absolutely. We're still meeting, COVID threw a wrench and everything. So,
yeah,
but we are still meeting. We actually had our first in-face meeting not too long ago. The public can get involved as well. Go to the Crazy Mountain Access Project on Facebook. or crazymountainproject.com is another place that the public can weigh in their opinions and talk about things. So yes, we are very involved. Haven't seen Mary for a while, but that's okay because we're all busy and we're all doing stuff, and but we have some great partners in that group, and I think that, you know, from my perspective, from Montana Wildlife Federation's perspective, I think we have a group of people that honestly care about the public access and honestly care about coming to some decisions about how we're going to move forward in this mountain range that's super complex. I mean, it's a really if you look at the map of the Crazy Mountains, it's a complex mess, right? And so so you can get involved for sure. I see, like, this is the very beginning of the Crazy Mountains issues, and I think and so what we're developing here is relationships with landowners, with the Forest Service, with many other folks who want to be involved, who want to have a conversation, not just carry on, but and try to figure out what we're going to do here, because this is the very beginning of the process for me. I can see how, you know, there's a lot of land in the middle that's not green, that of course, as an environmental group, we want to see more green in the crazies than ever before, you know. So we've involved people, again, the Crazy Mountain Stock Growers Association, Park County Environmental Council, the Crow tribe is involved in this as well, because I think Crazy Peak is super important to them, and David Lucian's been wonderful to work with them and provide permanent access to Crazy Peak, because that means the world to the Crow tribe, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So, you know, we're working on it. We're going to keep working, and we're going to keep fighting, and we're going to do the best things for the public.
Well, so we're starting to push an hour here. You know, what I would say is, again, I've seen old maps of the Gallatin Forest. I think at one time the entire Madison Range was checkerboard ownership, Mary, and that was some of the deals. I mean, we wouldn't have the Lee Metcalf Wilderness. So, you know, this is a continuation of decades of work, and looking, yeah, we're talking about the crazies here in public access, but what I'm hopeful for is this becoming a template for this to happen on a valley by valley or landscape by landscape scale, because as much as we've cleaned up, we still have a lot of checkerboard lands throughout not just Southwest Montana, but all over Montana and around the West. And I don't know where else you worked in your career, Mary, but you're saying, was this a common issue throughout many other states with the National Forest System? Or?
Well, I worked mostly in Oregon and Utah. I mean, it's a common issue around the West, although I think I look at the old Gallatin Forest and the history of checkerboard, and it probably was a bit more extreme here than other places.
Right. Well, you know, I will say this: we have some amazing tools, and to hopefully continue to consolidate and block up these public lands. We just had this year passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which finally fully and permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is our best tool. We have Habitat Montana to start some of these deals. We have numerous nonprofit conservation organizations willing to put up dollars, and then, but it does still take a willing landowner. I mean, they are private lands. Sometimes you have landowners often who want to make that part of their legacy. And, you know, we just had a landowner, I mean, this is a fishing access site, but in the Bitterroot, who gave up $400,000 worth of value because she wanted to see that become public land. And so, but, you know, hopefully a deal like what is in a proposal on the east side of the crazies makes at least landowners think about that. And, you know, maybe I will want to sell some of these. I mean, that's up to them, but it hopefully it's a conversation starter.
I agree with you, Nick. And the other thing I want to add is, we keep talking about public land rights, and which I completely 100% agree. But we also have to always consider landowner rights. I mean, we keep saying how, they're doing this and they're doing this, but we have to negotiate. It has to be good for everybody. And when it's good for everybody, it means you don't get everything that you want, right? It means that you're going to get some things, but we should always consider the landowner rights as well, because, look at the East Side Crazies, folks. They've been there since 1895. Okay, 3 of the 4 families were there since 1895. The newcomers got there in 1905. So they've been around there. They've been taking care of things, and we really need to. I feel like, that we should respect their rights as well. And so that's what this is all about. This is about having conversation with landowners and public land advocates and the Forest Service. And hey, let's have a conversation. Let's figure out what we need. Let's figure out what we want, and let's make this happen. So I feel very fortunate to be part of this group. I feel very fortunate to have the Forest Service, Mary Erickson and Lauren, involved in this, in the sense that they ground us a little bit, and we just need to figure out how to work together and make great things happen for our communities. So
Sure. Well, and from our perspective, I mean, I still remember a meeting that wasn't involving the Forest Service, but in September of 2017, when this was blowing up, when I threw out a fresh map of the crazies and said, what would constitute adequate access here? And we identified 5 main trails. That West Side deal took care of 2 of them. So, and I mean, the Porcupine Low Line was in dispute, but remember, you had to cross 6.5 miles of private land before you hit the public land. Now, we're obviously known as a hunting organization, and we're a wildlife conservation organization, but you got to walk that far before you can take a ruffed grouse, let alone elk.
right.
Now we have a trail that is on public land, and accesses some good habitat and offers those recreational opportunities. So, well, I don't see any other questions coming in, or haven't received any, but any final thoughts, Mary or John? And I think we can wrap this up.
Mary, would you like to go first?
You're muted, Mary. It happens a
sorry,
lot.
I just muted myself. Okay. Yeah, I just have a couple things I would share. And, I'm going to echo some of the things that John said. But what I'd say is, Nick, to your point, I think this is all about taking the long view. I really am. You can sometimes, in the world of lands and access, get discouraged because it sometimes feels as if we're not keeping up with with some of the access challenges and the lost access points, and we hear that all the time, right? Because we have the potential with new people coming in, and the Forest Service doesn't always have the capacity to be on top of those things in real time and as quickly as we want to be or need to be. And yet I'm probably more optimistic now with the last couple of years of the working group in the crazies, with the passage of the Great America's Outdoors Act and that permanent authorization for LWCF, the fact that we need all the tools in our toolkit. We need the ability to have purchase easements. We need the ability to negotiate land exchanges. We need the ability to acquire lands outright. We need the ability to bring forth legal challenges where we actually have a strong case and feel like we can not only prevail, but we can set a good precedent. But we also need groups that are really willing to sit down and kind of roll up their sleeves and not have it just be the Forest Service, but really groups that want to bring people together and come up with solutions that try to consider really everyone's needs and come up with something that really works. And does that work 100% of the time? Absolutely not. But I think, and John, I know the group talked about it, is if you can model something like that in the crazies, in that complex landscape, and you can actually get something done, maybe not in 1 year, but maybe in a reasonable time period, you can also inspire people to do that other places. And to me, that's really what it's about, is starting to show that if you take the long view, you still have to show people we're making incremental forward progress. And I know for people in the crazies, it's not fast enough for sure for some people, but it feels to me like we are making progress. And there's a whole lot more progress on the horizon. That's my pitch.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. I agree with you. But I also think that the crazies stuff, as fast as it's happening, is very quick for these sorts of things. Like this is a complex deal. Okay. There's lots of people that are involved. There's lots of concerns. But we're very fortunate to have a group of people who want to work together. We really want to consider everyone's needs and wants. We've talked about that, and just do great things in the crazy. So yeah, I've been blessed to be part of this group and part of all of this, and I'm so encouraged by what I see, by good conversation, not pointed conversation, but really having sort of diving into the middle of this stuff and figuring out what's going to work for everybody. So yeah, I'm feeling very fortunate.
Great. Well, I'll wrap this up and just say that when we fold out the maps and we look at these deals, what I try to think about is, what will people think about what we did 100 years from now when we're all gone? Because or even 30 years from now, and when we're hopefully still here. But I mean, it's I try to look at the long view, and I know how different that public land landscape looked 30 years ago. So
It's amazing. Like, you think about 25 years down the road seems like a long way, but really when all the things we're working hard on, that we believe in our heart and our soul that we're doing the right things, we won't know for 25, 30, 50, or 100 years whether or not we did the right thing. But you have to do it based on the fact that you have some facts, and you want to do the right thing and that's how things happen. And yes, there will be someone down the road who will fix whatever mistakes we've made, right? Or move them forward in whatever manner. So, we're just doing the best we can. We're just trying to do the right thing.
right. Well, I would encourage everybody to keep paying attention, go to that website, look at this, and just know that MWF is going to continue to work on policies both at the federal and state level to increase that public access. So I want to thank both John and Mary. We're out of time, and it's been a great conversation. And have a great weekend. Thanks.
Thanks to you both. Great conversation. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.